If you want to kick it off.
Sure. Thank you. Good morning. My name is Harry Lassane. I'm the vice chair of the City of Charleston Planning Commission. Our chair, Charlie Carish, will either be late or not able to attend at all this morning. Unfortunately, he wished to give everybody his greetings. I'm joined by Sunday Limpesis, McKenna Joyce, Donna Jacobs, Bart Jackson. Jimmy, I don't know if Jimmy is on with us, but he's on. His Zoom is on, but I haven't heard from
I'm
him.
on.
Jimmy's here as well. This is a special informational meeting of the City of Charleston Planning Commission. We're going to hear about the progress of our zoning code rewrite from our consulting team that's been working on this. There are no public hearings. There will be no votes taken at today's meeting. And with that, I will turn this meeting over to Christopher Morgan and let him introduce himself and staff.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Harry. I am Christopher Morgan, Planning Manager at the City of Charleston. We've got other staff on here. Omar Mohammed is here. Eric Pullman is also helping with support. We are going to turn it over to Jeff Green and Craig Richardson with Clarion and Associates to go through their work so far and then have some questions and answers for you all. So with that, Jeff and Craig, and I think you've got your screen sharing going too.
Yeah, let me get that set up. Thank you very much, Christopher. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Great.
Okay, good morning. This is Craig. We really appreciate your taking the time to meet with us. What we wanted to do is we wanted to take an hour and a half and overview for you the code assessment. My understanding is that everyone has received a copy of this code assessment in terms of where we are going with the presentation.
Yeah, hold on. Okay, try now. Yep.
We're gonna take a minute or two and just sort of refresh your memory on the team that's working on this project. I'm going to also talk about the work for a few minutes. The work program is scheduled to sort of re-anchor you in terms of where we are in this process. It's about a 2-year process altogether. And then Jeff and I are going to review. We identify 5 or 6, key themes in the assessment, but we're going to overview what's in the assessment for each of these key themes. As we move forward in our presentation, we have slides where we're going to stop and for you to comment or to ask questions, but we want to make this as informal as possible. So to the extent that you have a question while we're making the presentation, please feel free to go ahead and ask the question. In terms of the team, Clarion is the prime consultant. We are a planning and growth management consulting firm consisting of city planners, attorneys, and design professionals. But a project like this requires a lot of other expertise. I'm not going to go through each of these individual firms, but we have 7 sub-consultants that are working with us in areas of design, legal, transportation engineering, and environmental issues. So in terms of the work program and schedule, I know we've gone over this with you in the past, but we want to remind everyone, sort of what this process is like and where we are in the process. It's about a 2.5 year process to update a development code. Hasn't been comprehensively done in Charleston in about 70 years, which is a long time. Our firm does a lot of work with local governments in comprehensively updating their development codes, and I would say probably the average timeline for local government. Doing such a comprehensive update is usually 25 to 30, 35 years. So it's been a long time. What we have also learned is it's important to have a systematic work program. And that's what we have in this for this project. There are 5 tasks. We started, about 6 or 7 months ago with kickoffs, and really that part of the process is one where the consulting team gets up to speed on your existing regulations. But in addition to that, we conducted a number of meetings and surveys, both with advisory groups, with planning commission, with others in the community, really trying to cast as broad a net as possible to get input from the community about, what are the important issues, what needs to be addressed in this development code update. In addition to that, one of the real key documents that we used in terms of identifying policy direction moving forward was your recently adopted comprehensive plan. Once we did that, we then started the second task, and that is a preparation of a code assessment. One of the things we have learned is that it's very important not to get input like we did in task 1, conduct an independent review, and then immediately start drafting. We have found that having an interim step, this code assessment, is very, very important. And what the code assessment does is it puts in writing sort of what we've heard from the community, the policy direction that we've identified from the plan and from other policy documents about the issues that need to be addressed in the code update and the updated code. We identify that in the code assessment. We conduct an evaluation of your existing regulations, asking the question, how do the existing regulations address these issues that are important to the community? In many instances, they aren't addressing them adequately or not addressing them at all, and we make recommendations for how that can be done. In addition to that, the code assessment at the very end of the document includes an annotated outline that really spells out, if the recommendations in the assessment are followed, then this is how the updated code will be restructured. And that's the document that we're presenting on, that we've met with several of the other advisory boards on already. And we'll be conducting some public meetings in about 2 to 3 weeks on this to get public input. But and we're really interested in input. What we have found is, based upon the input, the community reviewing this document and providing us input, we will make refinements to the recommendations. And, once we have made those refinements, that's when we start the drafting process. That's task 3. Task 3 is the sort of the heavy lifting task, where we actually do the drafting. We will use that annotated outline and as sort of a roadmap for the drafting. So in other words, you will, whatever we ultimately decide on in terms of what issues need to be addressed and what structure we need to use, it'll be in that annotated outline. And so the community will have a good idea of what to expect at a fairly high level in the draft materials that we'll be producing. Development code's large. So what we have also learned is it's important to break up the drafting. We're going to do it in 3 modules or 3 installments. And once we have drafted an installment or a module, we will conduct meetings like we're doing on the assessment, get community input. We'll go through this process. That's about a year-long, 14-month process. And at the end of that process, we will have gotten a lot of community input. We'll made some revisions to the draft. We go to task 4. Task 4 is actually testing the draft regulations. And really the purpose of the test is to answer the question, are the draft regulations addressing or meeting the objectives or goals we have for the code update? And we do this with this test is we'll take individual sites, actual sites in the city, and we will look at what someone could develop under the existing regulations versus what they could develop under the draft regulations. And that information, that analysis will be made available to the public. We'll have meetings on those. Our experience has been we will be making some revisions and to the regulations based on that testing and direction from staff and the community. And then we go to task 5, and that is making the revisions, and we'll have a public hearing draft document. Our experience has been by the time we go through this process with a lot of bites at the apple, so to speak, then the updated code will be ready for a public hearing process. So where's task 2? There are 5 tasks. That's sort of where we are in the process. Once we complete task 2, then we will be starting the real heavy lifting part of this project in task 3. So that's sort of where we are, where we're going. I'll just mention for you, for those of you who haven't been using the website, there is a project website. For example, the electronic version of the code assessment is on the website, address newchsstandards.com. There's also other information. There's information about public meetings or other meetings that will be conducted in the community on each of the work products. And there's a lot of other relevant background information. With that, are there any questions about sort of where we are and where we're going? If not, Jeff and I are going to launch into this code assessment. So there are, with respect to the code assessment, there are 5 key themes that we have identified. In other words, it's what the assessment is diagnosis is organized under 5 key themes. What Jeff and I are going to do, I'm not going to, these are the 5 key themes. I'm not going to read for you each of these key themes right now, but Jeff and I are going to cover each of them in chronological order in the presentation. The first theme is to create user-friendly regulations. This is typically a theme that we just about invariably, just every community where we're doing a comprehensive update want to address. As I mentioned earlier, it has been many years since your current development regulations have been comprehensively updated. There have been, really amazing advances in software technology, especially in the last 10 to 15 years, in terms of what we can do in terms of making a code document look much better and make it much easier to read. And there are other things that we have learned over the years in terms of structuring a development code and the use of language that will help make development code much more user friendly. We got 4 or 5 specific recommendations in the assessment for creating more user-friendly regulations in Charleston. First is to make the structure more logical and intuitive. I'll talk about that in a minute. Secondly is the use of more graphics, illustrations, and tables. Improving the document formatting. Your current regulations are very text heavy. Using more precise language, especially with respect to the review of development standards that are used, and then to some degree, and where it is appropriate, streamlining and clarifying review procedures. In other words, where there are procedures that sort of overlap and serve similar purposes, you want to try to consolidate those. Or if there is a procedure that maybe is being used in practice but is not in your current code, you want to codify that. With respect to the organization, the current regulations, because they have been updated on an ad hoc basis for many, many years, aren't necessarily intuitively or logically structured. I mean, there is some organization, but what we have found is that there are some regulations, for example, that just have been put in fairly illogical places. What we have found is that there are basically 3 organizing concepts that are key to logically organizing a set of development regulations. Those key concepts are, first, procedures. In other words, development review procedures, whether rezonings or special uses, special exceptions, variances, etc. And what we are proposing in the updated code is that those procedures should be organized in one article, and that would be Article 2. The table on this slide actually outlines how we propose to reorganize the updated code. As you can see, there are 9 articles. But Article 2 would be a place where all of the procedures would be consolidated into one article. The second key concept are your zone districts and your use regulations. And beyond the fact that we point out in the assessment, for example, that you're using a very old, antiquated set of use classifications right now based on the standard industrial code. We make a recommendation that those be changed. We also, in terms of structure, we recommend that all of the zoning districts be located in one article, Article 3. The use regulations in one article, Article 4, they be side by side and they be very well integrated so that as someone goes through and looks at a zoning district, and I'll talk about this organization of the zone districts in a little more detail in a minute when we talk about graphics, that it's very easy then to flip to a use table to identify what uses are allowed in the zoning districts. The third key concept in a development code are your development standards, your site development standards. Parking, landscaping, signage are examples of development standards. And then there are, in addition to those site development standards, are subdivision standards. So we recommend that all of the development standards go into one article, Article 5, and then subdivisions into 6. They be side by side. So in other words, your key organizing concepts, procedures, Article 2, zone districts and uses 3 and 4, development standards 5 and 6 would all be consolidated. And then I don't want to say that the other articles are extraneous, because they're not, but they basically support the administration of the development code. We are recommending all nonconformities go in Article 7. That'll be a short article. All enforcement provisions be consolidated in 8, and then all definitions be consolidated in 9, along with a section on rules of measurement. When I mean rules of measurement, in other words, if you want to know how to measure height, for example, or a setback, then there'll be a rule of measurement in that rule of measurement section. So basically, that's the organizational what we believe is a logical organizational structure that we're recommending. So I mentioned earlier, the advances in software technology in the last decade, or even 12, 15 years, have been pretty amazing for those of us who have been doing this for 25 plus years. What we can do now in terms of integrating photographs, tables, three-dimensional drawings, other graphics, really can make a development code much easier to understand and to read. This slide actually shows, and we've got several examples in the assessment, this slide shows sort of the general structure that we're proposing to use in laying out your zoning districts instead of all text. As you can see, and this is not a zoning district from Charleston, this is from another community whose code we've updated fairly recently. But as you can see, the purpose statement is in text in the far left on that first page. And then there are photographs and illustrations of development form that carry out the purpose, the general character proposed for the district. Right below that is a reference to the uses that are allowed, and that would be in a use table in the next article. And then below that are the dimensional standards that would apply in the district. That's all on the first page. And then on the second page would be a three-dimensional drawing that actually links to the dimensional standards table to actually graphically show one user how the dimensional standards would be applied on a specific site. And then the final table at the bottom of the second page actually references any other applicable development standards that would apply to the district. What you can see, one of the things we have learned is that you can lay these districts regulations out in a couple of pages for most districts. It can, occasionally it might, excuse me, be a little bit longer, but this is the direction that we are suggesting you go to. We think it's a much more user-friendly layout. So I think those are sort of the key concepts in creating a user-friendly code, with the exception of the procedural efficiency, and Jeff's going to cover that issue.
Thanks, Greg. And just so you all know, we do have several slides where we sort of take a pause for questions and comments. So that'll be the next slide. But we'll also have time at the end for any questions and answers. So administrative procedures, the review and approval procedures are really critical part of development regulations. They govern everything from amendments to the text of the zoning ordinance, rezonings, map amendments, all the way down to things like sign permits. So it's important that development review procedures be easy to understand, so that they provide clear guidance for landowners who need to know what they can do with their property. And so that they also provide clear guidance for staff and for review bodies that are evaluating development applications and need to make decisions in accordance with the standards that are set forth in the regulations. So as Craig mentioned, one of our key recommendations is to consolidate all of the development review procedures into one article. That'll be Article 2, Administration. Currently, there are development review procedures found throughout the zoning ordinance in many different sections. And so we propose to bring it all together. We propose to include a summary table of procedures. This is an excerpt of the summary table that we include in the code assessment, and that we propose be included with whatever modifications are discussed during this process in the new zoning ordinance. And so you can see on the left side are a list of the different procedures grouped by the type of procedures that they are. And on the top, you can see all the different review bodies that are involved in reviewing at least one of the development applications. And within the columns, you can see that the role that each body has, whether they are providing a review and or a recommendation, as staff typically does, whether they are involved in making a decision on an application, whether they have appellate authority to review a decision by staff or by some other body, and whether or not a public hearing is required. So this makes it so that everybody involved in the land development process can see at a glance who is going to be involved in the decision-making process for a particular type of application. We propose to add a standard set of procedures that apply to, generally every development review process. Now, obviously, the requirements for public notice and some of the substantive requirements are very different for a rezoning request versus, say, a sign permit. But there is a lot of commonalities. And so we think it's really helpful to have a section on standard procedures. And so when you have, there are specific sections for each individual procedure, and instead of repeating the same language every time, it simply references these standard procedures and identifies any changes. Getting to some of the more substantive recommendations, we heard from staff and from other stakeholders that it would be helpful to enhance the notification procedures. One of our recommendations, again, as part of the restructuring, is to bring all the notification procedures together to make it clear what's required, but also to add some additional notification procedures to make it so that everybody is informed about development applications. So, one place that the current regulations maybe fall short, and this is pretty common, honestly, in just about every community we work in, is that there's a lot of notification, mailed notification to property owners. But if you're a renter, you may not know about the development application because there may be posted notice, there may be published notice for those who still read newspapers, but there's no notification to people who are renting or people who are leasing property. So we think one of the recommendations we make is that there be additional notification to those people. There are some existing city procedures. If you go on the city's website, if you're looking to annex property, if you're looking to change the urban growth boundary, there are forms you can fill out and for doing that, but there's not actually procedures in the development regulations. We think it's important that the development regulations include, that the zoning ordinance include all of the potential procedures that a landowner could do. So we're recommending that those be added into the code. And those are, if you look through the assessment, you'll see all of those different procedures in the table. And there's also some discussion of them. We'll talk about this more when we talk about the changes to the districts, but we do recommend some updates to the plan development procedure. We recommend that there be a new zoning compliance procedure, and we've talked about sort of modifying this a bit, but there are certain circumstances where there is a review, where staff needs to review a proposal to make sure that it is compliant with the zoning ordinance. So it could be a change of use, it could be some sort of a small project on the site, but there's not really a clear procedure for doing so. And so we recommend adding that procedure. Talk about a formal procedure for zoning ordinance interpretations. Hopefully you don't need to do a lot of that when this is adopted, but over time, obviously, there will be new types of uses. There will be places where there are applications or requests that, maybe weren't thought about when the code was adopted. And so by having a formal procedure for interpretations, it makes clear how city staff has interpreted the zoning ordinance, and so that future applicants can rely on that interpretation, or the code can be amended to resolve whatever ambiguity there was. And finally, we're recommending that the new zoning ordinance include an administrative adjustment procedure. This allows for sort of very small modifications where necessary to some of the development standards. So, for example, small adjustments to the allowed height, small adjustments to the setbacks. Now, you can get these through the variance procedure, but that requires demonstration of a hardship It's a reasonably high standard. It's a lengthy process. We propose an administrative adjustment procedure, which allows staff, up to a specified percentage. It could be 5% of the setback or 10% in situations where it's really needed based on the particular characteristics of the property, where it would make sense to allow these types of adjustments. Again, they would be limited. The landowner would need to show that it's necessary. It's not just sort of anybody who wants to can apply for administrative adjustment. But we have found that where it's allowed, by allowing these sort of very minor deviations from the standards, it can help make the land development process go more smoothly. So we are at our sort of first pause. If you all have any questions, and if you have questions and want to hold them to the end, you can do that as well.
Let's
Okay.
keep dropping ahead.
All right.
Excuse me, Jeff, I have a question.
Yes, go right ahead.
In the proposed development review procedures, your chart, is there any way that that we can know the dates that the applications were made in for instance, in all the examples for Board of Adjust, for the DRB or for, different processes that they have to go through. So we know if it's been around for 4 weeks or 2 weeks, and is there a time frame?
Do you mean for the for an individual application, or for just
For an individual application?
So that is something we could recommend that sort of staff make clear in the and is this in reference to sort of applications that come to you that you're not sure how long they've been hanging around?
No, I'm talking about just the process. I mean, what an individual or a developer, in this particular case, a development agreement or an individual, but, when you have to go through a process, for, to go to everybody, to go to stormwater, to go to whatever, is there a process that we can know the dates that they were started, so that, the biggest complaint is that it takes too long. And since this is a streamlining process, we really don't know how long the process is taking. We only hear complaining.
After codes are comprehensively updated, typically the communities have been adopting what they call administrative procedures manual. And the manual will, we're proposing that, for example, that all the application requirements we put in a manual, but other kinds of information that could be included in the manual as a requirement, for example, that the date the application was submitted be included in the staff report, when it goes to the Planning Commission. So I would say that instead of putting it in the actual regulations, that it would be better placed in the manual, but that clearly could be done.
And Sunday, just so for your own information, we now list every project has to go to TRC, even if it doesn't have to stop at Planning Commission. Every project has to go to TRC. And on all those TRC agendas, it shows where they are in the process, when they started the process. So each agenda item now lists, started at TRC on this date, it's made these different visits, that kind of thing. So, and those are out every week. So if you aren't getting access to those, let us know and we can get you on that list so you can look at those anytime.
Well, Christopher, you know what I'm talking about. That, what I hear from being the development representative is that it stays too long in this department. They haven't gotten a return phone call from somebody. I mean, that's what I hear. And I'd love to be able to answer that, if somebody asks me that question. And I know for a fact it's taken a long time in the past. I've not heard a lot of complaints lately. So that's, good news. But that's part, and it's really not even for the Planning Commission. It's just for the process. We'd like to know too on the Planning Commission, but for the process, for the person going through this and the time frame that we're trying to make this more user friendly. That's part of the making it more user friendly to whoever's doing the application.
And that's a new modification to the TRC agendas, is to put all those dates on there. And I think that's letting everybody, all the people attending TRC, the applicants, everybody like that, know exactly how long something has been going through. And, some things, the city has no control over, like how quickly the applicant responds back to comments and things. But there is no doubt that, you know, we have a very complicated and thorough stormwater regulation process. And, you know, that's what ends up taking the most time on almost all projects.
Well, that, and I think trees, you know, I mean, but these are all things that, believe me, I do know how long they take. And I'm just trying to get the process streamlined so that the complaints don't come in the city's, you know, the city is more responsive. I mean, I know the people that I'm talking about that are responsive. But, you know, I've just heard complaints for being on this commission for a long period of time, but that's always been a challenge. And I think it's important for us to know if something's taken. You know, if it's the applicant's fault, then it's on them. I'm talking about the city's response.
Mhm. Mhm.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Any further questions? Okay. I'm going to move on to talk about the zone districts. We had, you know, based on we took a really close look at all 100 and more zoning districts in the city. And that's including, you know, base zoning districts, as well as the overlay districts and the overlay sub-districts. You know, one of our key goals was to simplify where possible, identify sort of areas with redundant or unnecessary districts where we could perhaps consolidate or not carry forward some of the districts, to modernize them, to make them more user-friendly. And Craig showed an example of that a few slides ago. Another key goal is to accommodate the type of development called for in the Charleston City Plan, which was adopted just a few years ago. This includes, you know, allowing a greater variety of housing types, but also allowing, you know, based on the fact that, you know, water level, you're in a rising water environment, there's increased flooding at lower levels and projected increased flooding worsening over the years, to encourage development at higher elevations and to improve the resiliency of development at lower elevations. Another goal was to reduce the reliance on planned unit development zoning. Talked about that a little bit, but the goal is to have a set of base zoning districts that can better accommodate the types of development that the city wants to see. And that has benefits of improving predictability and moving away from sort of a case by case, you know, development by development custom set of regulations. And finally, one of our recommendations was which we'll get into, is to establish separate districts for the Lower Peninsula. And by Lower Peninsula, I generally mean the you know, historic core of Charleston. That's a part of the city that, you know, has developed over hundreds of years. It has a very different form than the rest of the city. And given sort of the nature of development that has occurred there, the nature of development that occurs elsewhere in the city, we thought it would be appropriate to establish a separate set of residential, mixed use, and business districts for the Lower Peninsula, and then a separate set that applies outside the Lower Peninsula. And again, we'll go into greater detail on that in a moment. As I mentioned, you know, the goal is to direct development to the higher elevations, higher ground, with mixed use districts that allow both increased residential density and increased commercial intensity mixed together in mixed use districts, to allow more types of housing. You know, Charleston, in recent years, like many communities in the United States, the types of housing that is often built is either single family detached homes, sometimes townhomes, or, you know, large apartment buildings, and sort of that missing middle gets lost. And finally, to sort of adjust dimensional standards to increase development resiliency, and also to increase equity concerns, to make sure that we have standards in these zone districts that best reflect sort of the goals that are intended, and that they don't, you know, excessively make it hard to develop. So as I mentioned, we're recommending two sets of residential and mixed use districts, one set for the Lower Peninsula, generally the historic areas, and one set for the remainder of the city. We think that just better supports the city's development and redevelopment goals. You know, when you develop in the Lower Peninsula, there is already a rich neighborhood fabric with buildings and And we think that by having a separate set of districts, that can allow redevelopment to take place in the Lower Peninsula, and reduce the need for planned development, for variances, and for other one-off adjustments on individual development sites. But by having this separate set of standards for this very unique part of the city, it allows us to craft zoning districts that better reflect the development context that applies outside of the Lower Peninsula. But there would be some institutional districts and other types of districts that would apply throughout the city as well. So on the Lower Peninsula, our key recommendation, and you can see the sort of specific recommendations on the right, but one of the key components of these districts is we propose to use contextual dimensional standards. So instead of having your standard requirements for a minimum front setback, a minimum side and rear setback, we would have standards that look at the properties next to this development site, the properties across the street from the development site, the properties on the same block. It would be sort of one of those types of comparisons, so that new development matches the form of that development. Now, that's something that, if you're doing greenfield development somewhere, in West Ashley, you can't use those types of contextual developments because you don't have that, neighborhood fabric, that's gridded street system where you can make those sorts of contextual comparisons. But we think that it's appropriate to do so on the Lower Peninsula, given the nature of the existing development. On the right, you can see our recommendations. We are proposing that 2 of the single family districts and the duplex district be consolidated into the Lower Peninsula Residential Low District. Now, that's a district that will allow a gentle mix of development types. So not only single family homes, but also sort of modest, but also 2-family throughout that district. So again, that will allow sort of the greater types of housing options that are discussed in the city plan. We're recommending that DR1 and 1F be combined into the medium density, so that will generally carry forward what's allowed in DR1 and DR1F with some additional retirement and elderly uses. And perhaps we're considering allowing some compatible commercial and office development. And the Lower Peninsula Residential High Density District will consolidate DR2 and DR2F, and again, allow generally the types of development that are allowed in those districts, again, with those contextual standards. You can see our recommendations to the mixed use districts. The big difference here, and it's something you'll see when we show the districts that we're proposing outside of the Lower Peninsula. We propose that the commercial transitional district be rezoned to commercial limited. And we're also proposing adding standards so that, the idea behind commercial transitional is so that the commercial development, which is adjacent to residential neighborhoods, is of an appropriate size and scope. And we're proposing having additional development standards that serve the same purpose, that ensure that any commercial or office development that occurs next to a low intensity residential neighborhood is designed in a way that mitigates the negative impacts that development may have on that residential community. So that's this is another point for some questions and comments if anybody has some, but just to caution you, we have a lot more districts to go through. Yes.
I have one question. How did the Preservation Society Historic Foundation, when you did the technical advisory, feel about that for the Lower Peninsula? What was their comments on that?
I think, and I'll ask Christopher to chime in if he remembers differently. Part of the reason we're recommending that here is because, you have the Old City Height districts, which apply throughout the historic areas, which regulate height, which we're proposing to carry forward. And you also have the Board of Architectural Review and those design standards that apply, which we propose to continue as well. So I think when you take into account that you have those standards that control the height as well as the design, and then we're focusing on contextual standards, which are again designed to make sure that new development fits within the fabric of the existing development. They didn't say so specifically, but I think that's what we were thinking of, and how that would sort of continue the make sure that development in those historic areas is appropriate for the area.
Thank you.
And I'll just add that, you know, I think more discussion will be coming forth on that, but I think that the thing to remember about this area is that BAR is really the biggest thing, you know, whether a building is set back, you know, 5 feet or 8 feet or something like that, which is what we get so many variance requests in that area for, you know, that's not as important as how the overall structure looks or amendments or additions to the structure looks, and BAR is covering that. So I think with that recognition, you know, I think you could do this type of consolidation and still preserve the character of the area because you got BAR doing that.
I personally am very excited about this concept for both the Lower Peninsula and the rest of the city. I was just curious what they might have responded to that. Thank you.
Yeah, I've got a question. How will this work when you're consolidating a number of different districts? And also, for example, I'm looking at SR4, SR5, and STR, short-term rental, being consolidated into one category. How explain how that would work just in practice.
So that's supposed to be single 2-family. So I think that might be a typo there. Yeah, apologies for that.
Okay, got it. All right.
But one thing we looked at when we decided to consolidate districts, and you'll see this off of the peninsula as well, is we looked at the dimensional standards that currently apply, setbacks, height, and all that, and they're they're close enough that we thought it was appropriate to consolidate them, and it would not have a significant impact on the character of the neighborhood by having having a single set of standards that apply to the districts.
Yeah, the other thing I'll just mention, and I think it really needs to be emphasized, is based on our experience, we've used these contextual standards in a number of communities that are built, and right now you have very, very complex dimensional standards in the historic district. By going to contextual standards, when we consolidate, there shouldn't be any nonconformities. I mean, basically all you're doing is you basically say that the setback, front yard setback needs to be within 15% of the average on the block face. You're just basically saying you have to mimic what's already there. So I think we believe that it will reduce the need to go through the variance process, reduce the situation where there are nonconformities because of the existing dimensional requirements in your code, but it's not gonna affect the development form. It's not going to affect the character. So.
Sunday, you're on mute.
You keep referring to the historic district. Are we talking about Lower Peninsula as well in this?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
I mean, we're not the old city district and the old and historic district. Those are proposed to continue to remain.
Essentially, Sunday is the area south of Line Street.
Right. Well, that's what I was hoping. Okay. I mean, that's what needs the most work. So good.
Okay. Outside the Lower Peninsula, so we have a couple pages of changes to the residential districts. Again, no changes to those 3 single-family districts that you see listed there. We're proposing to rename them again for consistency, for clarity. Those numbers represent the maximum allowed density in units per acre. We're proposing that the rural residential district be deleted. We talked about this in the code assessment, but those properties can either be rezoned to one of the RSF districts, the single family districts, or we have we talk a little later about some of the low impact and conservation districts that we're proposing for lands that are subject to flooding. One of our big recommendations is to consolidate these 7 separate districts, including 4 single-family districts, the single 2-family, and those diverse residential districts into one residential mixed flow district. The goal is to allow in these existing districts a mix of housing types from currently what's allowed in all these districts, this single-family detached, up to buildings with 4 units in a single structure, with some additional standards to improve the walkability of development in the neighborhoods. There may be some basic form and design standards, considering whether to allow, again, compatible, low intensity, low impact commercial or civic or office development within these neighborhoods, perhaps only at certain corridors or major intersections, and new standards for some of the housing types that would be permitted there, such as cottage home developments. We're proposing carrying forward DR12 as residential mixed medium. And we are also proposing consolidating 4 of the diverse residential districts into the residential mixed high district. Again, some basic form and design standards. Currently, I think they allow up to 16 units per acre. We're considering whether it would be appropriate to maybe go up to 25 units per acre in these districts. To meet the city's goals for allowing higher density of residential development in those parts of the city that are at a higher elevation, that are at less risk for flooding. And finally, the DR4 district, that's the elderly housing district. We propose that type of housing use be allowed in some of the other residential mixed districts, and not in its own zoning district. We have some recommendations to the business and mixed use districts as well. You'll see some of these are very similar to what we propose on the Lower Peninsula. General practice these days is to allow office uses within commercial districts as part of sort of general office and commercial districts. So we're recommending that the general office district be deleted and those lands rezoned to some of the other commercial districts that are allowed. Residential office will continue because that's sort of a very specific type of office use. We make the same recommendations for the commercial transitional, the limited business, and the general business districts that we made in the Lower Peninsula. We're considering deleting the business park district, and that's something we're continuing to have discussions with staff about and would welcome input. It depends on whether we think there are further discussion about whether it's serving a necessary purpose and whether there are existing sites in the business park district that could be rezoned to one of the other districts, either one of the commercial districts or to the light industrial district. And we're proposing carrying forward the job center district as well as the Upper Peninsula district. Some of the concepts in the Upper Peninsula district we may also apply more generally throughout. And we have similar proposals for sustainability and resilience that we'll talk about later in the presentation. Another pause for questions and comments here if anybody has any.
I have a question, sorry.
Yeah.
Were we just talking about the peninsula? You said outside the Lower Peninsula. Is this across the board or is this just for the peninsula?
It is on the Upper Peninsula and elsewhere in the city. So James Island, those parts of James Island and Johns Island that are within the city as well, and West Ashley.
I'm a little nervous about the DR zonings being, if you have somebody that has a residential right next to a DR1F that's been zoned for a long time or DR anything, and you're going to allow somebody to be able to possibly do 25 units next door to a single family, which was now an SR1.
Mm-hmm. We'll take a look at that. The DR1, we are let me hop back. Yeah, so we can take a look at that and look at areas on the map where that would be an issue. The other option, of course, is to continue with this consolidation and rezone some of those properties to a lower intensity that's maybe more in line with what's allowed now.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Just quick question. what were the numbers on the potential changes to density? It was something to 25. I just couldn't hear that.
Yes, it was, I believe it's currently 16 units per acre. And so we recommended considering whether to increase that up to 25.
Yeah, I've got a question that's I guess somewhat philosophical. When you have these districts, for example, residential office, I assume you're essentially saying we're going to continue to have a residential office zoning category. We're just going to change the name of it, and there might be some things. I'm just thinking from a public standpoint where these things, these zoning categories are, they're in the lexicon of people who know Charleston, have lived here for a long time. I would just say, you know, if there's a way to keep the names consistent, you know, let's just not do change for change's sake. You know, if there's going to continue to be a residential office category, let's just continue to call it residential office, unless there's a good reason to change it. I don't want to cause more confusion than we have to.
Yeah, yeah. No, that makes sense. I mean, part of the thought, and you know, we have some renamings of the residential districts. You know, our general idea is, you know, residential starts with R, office starts with O, commercial starts with C. You know, our overlay districts, you'll see we have very modest changes to those names, but they end with a -O to make clear that they're an overlay district. So the idea behind, you know, flipping residential office to office residential is it's an office use in residential structures. So, but and you know, if you have R, then there's confusion with a residential district. But that
makes sense.
We continue, you know, to have discussions about.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to also echo what you said, because I've noticed some nomenclature issues as I've gone through this document, and I'm going to go ahead and point this out, even though you haven't mentioned it. You're talking about naming a new district called low impact, and you give it the LI district, which for the beginning of time has been known as light industrial. So people are going to start reading this document and going, wait a minute, LI is now low impact, and they couldn't be further from each other. So I might recommend, based on Mr. Lissane's comment, that there be some kind of table created for everybody to look at that sort of says, here's what they were and here's what they're proposed, to make sure that we don't have any of these nomenclature conflicts like the one he just pointed out, because it's going to get really hard to have people change LI in their mind from light industrial to low impact. I even recommend that we put a C in front of it to say conservation, so people get a clue.
Yeah.
But I think that we really need to look at those. Otherwise, people start reading quickly and they kind of start losing their mind for the wrong reasons, and then we can't pull them back off the ledge about it. So
yeah,
I do think we need a review of the nomenclature. Thank you.
No, thank you for that. And if there are other, and we recognize the LI confusion. If there are other areas where you think there are potential confusion from the naming, please do let us know.
Yeah, and I think that might just be like being upfront with the explanation you just gave about having the first letter mean this and the second letter means that. And we've never had that kind of naming convention here before. And perhaps that, you know, should be explained up front so that people understand it. So.
Thanks. Any more questions? Excuse me. So one of the recommendations that we include in the assessment is we suggest that there be 2 form-based overlay districts applied. And this is because we think in some areas of the city where there's been, you know, planning around the desired form of the area and how it develops over time, that it might be appropriate within the zoning regulations to establish in greater detail how you know, the form of future development. So height, not only things like height and setbacks, which are regulated through the other districts, but massing, basic building and site design standards, all that is in service of meeting the vision that the community has for that area. A common way to do so is through developing form-based districts. These prioritize, the context of development and the urban form over the types of uses that are allowed in the structures on those buildings. Typically, in developing a form-based code, you hold a community charrette with a lot of sort of public involvement and iterative development of standards for the area. And then once the charrette is held and there's a community vision identified, then the regulations are drafted to implement that vision. So we looked at several criteria to identify areas where it might be appropriate to have form-based districts. One of those obviously is the future land use map designation. We want to make sure that we're encouraging this type of development in areas where the city has identified for future development. So that includes, and we'll show the future land use map later, but this includes the areas identified as the city center, where the highest intensity of development is projected in the future, and the neighborhood edge districts. We looked at areas where there have been recent studies. So Rethink Folly Road and Plan West Ashley are two recent sort of small area plans that the city has conducted. And there are also parcels within West Ashley that are part of a tax increment financing district, which is really intended to encourage development and redevelopment, and which is another criteria we looked at that might be appropriate. So we have evaluated 3 different areas where it might be appropriate for a form-based code. And we're proposing to move forward with 2 of them. So again, you'll see in the assessment and on these slides 3 different areas, but we're proposing that 2 be selected for form-based coding. So the first is along Rittenberg and Savannah Highway. This is part of the area that was studied in Plan West Ashley. It's a commercial corridor. It's largely within the general business district. You can see that the boundary lines have been selected to identify those areas which are in the city center and neighborhood edge, which are identified for redevelopment, while avoiding those areas that have existing residential neighborhoods where the intent is not for significant change into the future. We have out in Johns Island, we have Maybank Highway. This is an area, some of this land is actually not within the city. A good deal of it was within the county. But these are, if you look at the map sort of in the center and on either edge, there are 3 areas that are identified as nodes, as city center areas where greater intensity and density is recommended. And so we propose including sort of this entire corridor to connect these different nodes. And again, while much of the land is outside of the city, it can be annexed into the city as well. And finally, we propose a form-based district along Folly Road. The city plan directs growth along this corridor on the island. It's one of the only areas that is, at a higher elevation where it would be appropriate for more intense development to accommodate the development that's coming to the city. And this can also accommodate the Rethink Folly Road vision of development that's more supportive of multimodal forms of transportation. So again, just to pause for questions and comments, I can flip back through the slides. Yes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I think you mentioned that y'all chose these corridors because there's already some studies and plans and focus at these areas. With the one for West Ashley, why wasn't the entire corridor of Ashley River Road considered and not just its major intersection nodes, it appears? And why was the boundary chosen on Savannah Highway?
You mean down to here?
The Ashley River, there's the Ashley River Road corridor. There seems to be some focus for the code at where Old Town splits off and then where it hits Sam Ritten, but not the entire part of Ashley River Road, which is, I think, should be included personally. And then I would like an explanation as to why you chose that boundary to stop along Savannah Highway instead of considering more of the Savannah Highway corridor where like the auto mile and things of those nature.
Well, I can tell you about Savannah Highway. We did not include the auto mile, largely because it's the auto mile, because there's a lot of recent redevelopment that has occurred within that very auto-centric format. And so, given that this is a lot of new development, and there's some more compatible development that's going on, we thought that it was an appropriate place to stop.
Okay. But
Um,
the Ashley River Road corridor?
I would have to look. I imagine, looking at the future land use map, that those are areas that have not been identified as part of the city center, or the neighborhood edge. And so that there is existing development there, largely sort of lower intensity residential development that is desired to stay sort of the same and not have significant, increases in density or intensity. But we can certainly look at that.
Well, because I know along that corridor, there have been several attempts to demolish older residential homes for modern redevelopment that have been coming before the Design Review Board and for the Work Commission. And so given that there might be some of that intensity, I think it might need to be looked at. And also I was hoping that y'all could point us to maybe a really good, form-based codes for dummies kind of document to read, because I know that there is very strong opinion on both sides of those that form-based code thought process. And it's not something that I understand well enough to have an opinion, but it's sometimes polarizing. So if y'all could point us to form-based codes for dummy document, where we might could come up to speed on that, I'd appreciate it.
It's voluntary.
Yeah,
We
can absolutely do that. One thing to point out is that this is proposed as an overlay district. And so the idea is that if you're a landowner, you can opt in to develop under the sort of separate set of standards that apply in the overlay district. So that if you have a piece of land and you want to redevelop it, and it is general business today, and it will be the general commercial district in the future, you can continue to develop under that. But there will also be this form-based overlay, which provides, an opportunity for additional, to do additional density on the site, additional intensity. It probably allows for, it may allow for a broader variety of uses. And so it's really designed as an optional development option for landowners in the area, with the goal over time that the incentives for developing under the form-based district regulations are such that folks will want to develop over them, and that you'll sort of meet the community vision over time.
Thank you.
But one of the things that we are trying to do is before we move forward into drafting, is to sort of figure out where the boundaries of these districts are located. So we appreciate that comment. And if you have any other sort of suggestions after this meeting, we'd love to hear them.
You also.
Thank you.
We're going to pick two of these up.
Yeah. Any more questions on the form-based districts? And again, we're going to be moving forward with up to 2 of them, not all 3. So again, if you have suggestions about whether 2 are, you don't think we should move forward with 1, or you think 2 are clearly a better option than the others, we'd like to hear that as well.
What is the reason for only doing 2 and not 3?
That's partly just a project scope and budget issue, because these charrettes are pretty intensive.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And which 2? Maybe I missed that when you stated which 2 were being done.
Well, we're with that, and that's part of what we want input on as part of the code assessment review. We've identified these 3: the West Ashley, Maybank Highway, and Folly Road, and so we'd love your input as to which 2 we should move forward with. Here's that low impact district, which I expect will be renamed. But we're proposing that the low impact district be an option, which would allow sort of very limited development in those parts of the city which are going to be part of the, areas that are going to be subject to flooding in the future, either subject to flooding or where there's going to be marsh migration with sea level rise. We propose to carry forward the conservation district as well as the agriculture districts, but consolidating those two districts into one. We're not proposing significant changes to the industrial districts. Again, just changing the nomenclature to put the I first. We're recommending two sets of institutional districts. One district for schools. This would be, elementary schools, high schools. One of the things we're still thinking through is whether this should be the only district where those types of schools are allowed, or whether we should allow schools of a certain size in other types of districts. But then if you go larger on an acreage basis, then you would need to use the institutional school district. An institutional public, quasi-public is intended for public buildings as well as quasi-public institutions like the medical campus down on the Lower Peninsula. We also recommend that the PUD district be replaced with planned development. Now, the current plan development, the plan unit development is used pretty commonly throughout the city. Now, 30% of the land is zoned PUD. Now, a little bit of that is due to the fact of you have large areas like Daniel Island, which are technically under a PUD, but which is really its own sort of separate zoning code. So it's a little bit less than 30%, but there's still a good amount of PUD throughout the city. And the problem with that, it does a few things. First, it reduces the predictability of the zoning ordinance because it changes how land can be used from what the zoning district is or the other base districts that could be applied to very much a negotiated discussion. And so it reduces predictability for folks who live near areas that are rezoned for PUD. It increases the cost of development, because instead of having a base zoning district that has clear standards that apply, you need to individually negotiate them and craft those standards. It also makes the zoning map a little less legible, because instead of having clear districts that set forth what's allowed in each district, you have PUDs which have completely separate set of regulations. And so if you want to find out the intensity of development that's allowed, you need to look elsewhere. So we recommend addressing the issue with planned development districts in two ways. First, by having a more robust and complete set of zoning districts with updated standards. The goal is that these base districts can accommodate the types of development that the city wants to see, and that is attainable, the developers are willing to provide. And we're also proposing that the PD standards require that any PD development be innovative, something unique that really can't be built under the base district. So not just tweaks of what's allowed in current districts, but something that is really innovative, higher quality, and that perhaps provides city benefits above and beyond what the private developer is benefiting from. So we're proposing one planned development district, and this would replace the PUD district. We're proposing to carry forward these overlay districts, the accommodation and the short-term rental. Those are pretty unique to Charleston, but Charleston is a very unique city, and there's a lot of demand for tourist type uses, and so we think it's appropriate to carry those forward. We're also proposing to carry forward the Old City District and Old and Historic District overlays, along with the height districts and all the different sub-districts that apply. We're recommending some significant deletions of overlay districts. Some of these are being replaced by other base districts. So for example, the school district is one of those. In many cases, we are proposing that the existing regulations in these overlay districts be applied more generally. So the general business and light industrial late night districts, we're proposing be replaced by a more comprehensive set of neighborhood compatibility standards that would address the same types of issues that those overlay districts apply. In some cases, we're proposing eliminating the districts, but actually continuing those regulations. So there's the special parking district, special parking overlay zone on the Lower Peninsula. We're proposing to continue that, which exempts certain properties from minimum parking requirements, but having that in the development standards for parking and not as a separate overlay zone. We're not proposing to get rid of landmark properties. It's in most communities we work in, many of them have landmark properties. They're not on the zoning map. And so we would propose that the landmark provisions continue to apply, but that there not be a separate, layer on the zoning map for those overlay districts. The design review districts, and that's something we're sort of talking about. One of our proposals in the development standards is to have an updated set of design standards that apply outside of the Lower Peninsula, so not in the historic areas, but that do a better job of establishing basic form and design standards for new construction. One of the things we heard is that it can be hard for the design review board to evaluate projects because the design standards are very vague. And since you don't have that same sort of context that you do in the city's historic areas, that it is difficult, to decide, if a design sort of meets the standards that are set forth in the code. So we're proposing a set of enhanced and more measurable design standards, and we're continuing to discuss whether that's something that is sufficiently definite that staff can review, or whether we should continue to have the design review board. That is most of the zone district discussion. So if you all have any questions, yes.
Thank you. I have some strong opinions on the deletion of the DUWAP plan from that district. There was a lot of work done in the community. And I would like to see, I don't know that we have the time for that discussion right now, because I could probably occupy the next 30 minutes with that. But I would really appreciate a critical review of why that's being deleted, based on everything that was done by the community and the level of community involvement and the angst that went through to get that just right for the community. The other thing is this consideration of the design standards. I know in West Ashley, in particular, the Design Review Board has been a friend for redevelopment. To move everything to staff level would cause a great consternation to the people that are very involved in how West Ashley is redeveloped and how it looks. So I think those two need a really, really critical discussion and review. And I know we don't have the time for that now. I'm just very strongly, more strongly than I can say strongly, review of those two things.
Yeah, understand. One of the things we will be drafting design standards, which may address that concern to a certain extent. With regards to West Ashley, I mean, one of the reasons why we are proposing the form-based overlay for the West Ashley area is to, provide, a more robust set of form standards that reflect the community's vision for the area.
Well, and I understand that, but if you look at the corridors that are covered by the design review currently, it's a 3-column small print page, and you only have, 2 major roads and only really major intersections that are covered by your form-based overlay. And there has been a lot of situations where we would have lost historic properties because of demolitions or had very bad development. Even though you're recommending development standards, even standards are subjective as to who believes what looks good. Sometimes it is project by project, and it's also area by area. Things that are redeveloped inside of 526 look significantly different because of the age of the structures as to outside 526. You come into the area of Avondale where I live, things look significantly different than just down the street at the Auto Mile. And I'm not suggesting they should look the same, because I think the diversity is quite, quite beautiful for West Ashley. So I just think that this really requires some discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Ms. Jacobs mentioned time. we're about an hour and a half in, and judging by your slides, you're about halfway through the slides. So I guess the question is to the commission, do y'all want to stay on and try to get through all of these, or do we want to pause here and you know, maybe schedule some additional time for this? If commissioners have any thoughts.
I think it is, I agree with Mr. Lassane, our acting chair right now, because I submitted, I don't know, 7 pages of comments that, you know, I'm not going to occupy everybody's time with. I'm sure y'all got them. Some of them are just saying yes or no to certain things. Some of them, just like I mentioned with the overlay, is going to require some discussion that maybe once we got discussing it might take 15 or 20 minutes just to make sure the assessment is correct. So I'm open for whatever the group wants to do, but we haven't even hit some of the things that I have even greater concerns about.
Any thoughts from the rest of the commission on your availability moving
Harry,
forward?
why don't we keep going until we reach the limit, and then when we stop, we are going to have to reschedule another meeting.
I guess the question is, what is the limit? You know, I think that might vary from person to person, given how much time you blocked for this. So I'm just trying to get a sense from commissioners how much time you have. Are we going to start losing people? And if we're going to start losing people, then we probably need to, you know, pause and schedule another time.
I'm good till 12:30. This is Bart Jackson.
Okay.
I'm good.
I think,
I'd
yeah,
like to stay until noon, 12:15.
Okay.
I'm good till 12:30.
I'm good till 12:30 also. And plus the fact that after that period of time, we're probably in information overload anyway, you know.
Okay. Well, let's keep moving. If we can pick up the pace slightly, we're more likely to get through the.
This is your last district slide. There are several districts that we are proposing be made legacy districts, so that land that is currently in those districts will continue to be in those districts, but the intention is that new land not be assigned to these districts. And so, you know, the Kanhoy district, the mixed use district, we think there are better options for that type of development in the other base zoning districts that are proposed. We're also, you know, these 3 PUDs are mentioned. You know, we're not proposing that they go away, but it is unusual that they actually be included in the zoning ordinance. So we recommend that all of these references be placed in an appendix, and that just helps make the zoning ordinance a little easier to use and shorter. Craig touched on this, and for purposes of speed, I'll go through this quickly. We're proposing to update, you know, in your entire set of uses. Lots of them are not defined. We propose to define them all, make sure they have precise and clear definitions. We'll take your existing use-specific standards, put them all into Article 4, put them all consolidated so they're easy to find, update them as necessary, draft new use-specific standards where appropriate, and place everything in an easy-to-use consolidated set of use tables. And that brings us to theme 3, and I'm going to turn it back over to Craig.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Any questions about the use regulations? If not, the theme 3, the third theme, focuses on enhancing resiliency to rising water. This was a major issue in city plan. And, you know, initially in terms of sort of determining policy direction on this issue, we looked at city plan very closely. You know, what city plan does initially is it sort of sets the stage. It talks about the fact that certainly there has been sea level rise in Charleston over the last 2 or 3, 4 decades. It seems to be increasing. City plan estimates that by 2080, that there will be an additional 36 inches of sea level rise, which results in significantly more flooding at a much more frequent level at increasingly lower elevations, and even to some degree a risk of flooding at higher elevations. Given this fact, this issue of resiliency to a rising water environment is a core principle in city plan. I think the other thing that we felt like it was important to point out is the city plan is also very clear that the city's economic viability is going to be linked to how well city moving forward manages and adapts to sea level rise. In addition, based upon these just initial findings, city plan then lays out, I think, a framework that is very relevant to sort of regulatory modifications to address sea level rise. Initially, city plan in the land and water analysis identifies 4 elevation zones in the city with different degrees of rising water risk. First is high ground, and those are areas that are outside the 100-year floodplain and areas that are not subject to the storm surge of a Category 3 hurricane. Those are the areas that are the least risky in terms of development moving forward. Second zone is the adapt zone, which includes lands that is outside the 100-year floodplain, but land that would be subject to flooding and storm surge from a Category 3 hurricane. Third is the compound flood risk zone. These are areas that are within the 100-year floodplain, but areas that are not in this final zone that is the most susceptible to sea level rise. And then finally is that most susceptible area, that's the tidal flood risk zone. Those are lands that are at the highest risk of flooding. They are lands that are at 7 feet mean sea level and below. And these are the areas that the land and water analysis determined would be over time would be the point where you're not only going to get a lot of tidal flooding, but with a 3 feet increase in sea level rise, you're going to get marsh migration in these areas. So those are the 4 zones. I mean, they are geographic areas that are clearly identified in the plan. One of the things, this is not in the assessment, but one of the things that we determined is we used our GIS just so graphically you can see where these different elevation risk zones are located. As you can see, the darkest green is the high ground. I use the term sort of light brown, orangish is the adapt zone. And then the compound flood risk zone is the light gray, and the darker gray is the most susceptible area to flooding and risk, and that is the tidal flood risk zone. As you can see in this gray area, that the large part of the gray area on this map is that tidal flood risk zone. So graphically, this is sort of what the analysis and city plan identifies. In addition to that, and I think very relevant to a strategy for addressing sea level rise, are other recommendations in city plan, and those recommendations deal with 4 key strategies, regulatory strategies. First strategy is grow. These are the areas to focus new development, increase densities at the highest elevations. That's the high ground areas of the community. And then these other 3 strategies really apply in the other 3 zones. One is defend. The idea with defend is focus on protection of buildings and infrastructure with engineered measures, implementation on land, protection concepts. And as I said, they would apply to the other three zones. Adapt, and that is retrofitting vulnerable existing infrastructure to be more resilient, and that would apply in all the other in all zones, but primarily the other three outside of the high ground area. And then reserve, and this is the idea of let's modify our regulations to support and incentivize this idea of using natural systems to absorb rising water. And that would apply in all of the zones. So we've got the elevation zones identified in city plan, and then we've got the 4 strategies about how to deal with that. Based upon those concepts, and as well as other land use policies and existing development patterns in the city plan then identifies 12 land use categories for the plans on a future land use map. And there are 4 of these categories that are relevant to this issue of addressing the rising water environment. One is the city center land use category, and that is the area that should be applied to the high ground elevation zone, where it would accommodate a mix of land uses at the highest intensities in the city. Second is the neighborhood edge, which would also be applied in the high ground area. And it would accommodate neighborhood serving commercial and residential uses and mixed uses. The densities between 6 and 20 units an acre. This we use the term in the plan, low impact conserved land use category, which is the area designated to apply to land at the highest risk. That's titled flood risk zone. And then I also include this natural wetland area, and these are areas that are already wetlands and marshes, and are already subject to rising water. In addition to that, as I said, there were a total of 12 land use categories. And the other categories were not explicitly tied to the elevation zones, but that they would be, the thinking was they would be subject to the strategies, the defend, adapt, and reserve strategies, depending on which elevation zones they're in, as identified in the plan. So that's sort of the framework, and the sort of linking it to the land use categories. The other thing is, this is not in the assessment, but we also prepared a map to graphically show you these geographic areas in the city that where these different future land use categories would apply to sort of, those are the 12 categories. And then in this next map is the geographic areas where the map identifies both the city center land use category and the neighborhood edge land use category. I want to, in showing you this, one thing we want to identify is, as I said, the recommendations related to these elevation zones were a consideration in identifying these different, the city center and the neighborhood edge land use categories, but land use patterns also were relevant. As you can see, the city center designation in the lower peninsula area that's is proposed to be armed, is one where that extends into an area that would be subject to additional flooding until the arming occurs. This next map actually compares the land use categories for neighborhood edge and city center to the high ground areas. And so you can see graphically that a lot of these two land use categories are in the high ground area, but there are a few areas that extend outside of that high ground area. Then this final map graphic that we prepared actually shows the lands that are identified as the low impact conserved land use and the low impact conserved land use category, as well as natural wetland categories, which is, as you can see, is a pretty significant area in the city. And this is just another map. I'm going to pause here, see if there are any questions or comments on this. Nope. Okay. We will carry forward.
I actually have a question. How does, when I look at that map and it shows the high ground area, I see what appears to be two bits of bad news. Number one, there isn't a lot of it. That's bad news, number one. But the other is, it seems like in, particularly in West Ashley, where there is high ground, you know, academically, I completely support the idea that that's where we ought to put the most intensity and the most density and so forth. But based on my familiarity with the map, it also seems like that's going to create pretty significant conflict with the existing context. And how do you reconcile those two things?
It's a challenge to reconcile. You know, one of the reasons that we are proposing these form-based districts is that, you know, there will be much stronger emphasis on design and form. One of the things that we have learned, at least where these form-based districts have been successful, is that you can actually increase density fairly dramatically if your design and your form is you know, with that fit into moderately well fit into sort of, you know, I would say a low, I don't want to use the term lower density, but moderate density type of environment. But it's going to have to be a balancing act. I mean, one of the reasons we're showing, we felt it was important to graphically show geographically where these areas are and what's being proposed in the plan, is that it will be a challenge. I mean, the other issue that I do want to emphasize is that the plan and the policy direction as we understand it right now is not saying you don't develop in these areas outside of high ground. It's just that you have to do it in such a way that you are defending and you are reserving. So, you know, and there's some ideas or concepts that we'll talk about in a few minutes about how to do that too. But I mean, you pointed out a very good point. I mean, there are going to be some decisions that the community is going to have to make with respect to this issue. You know, another issue that we are going to point out in a few minutes is with respect to affordable housing. And, you know, you want to incentivize affordable housing by allowing additional density, but the most, you know, based upon this rising water environment, the best locations for these is going to be in these higher ground areas. So do you want to incentivize, you know, affordable housing in these areas? So I'm not answering your question because we don't have a real good answer right now, but I think your input on this issue in terms of how far we go is really, real important. Real important.
Sunday?
Yes,
I
this is
think
not,
that's something. I'll wrap up quickly. I just think that's probably a broader point that we as a commission are going to have to wrestle with. I suspect we don't all agree on the right answer there. It's tough, and there are trade-offs, and you can't solve it all.
Yeah, I am optimistic. And one of the commissioners asked us to send an example of a form-based district. So you can take a real closer look at it. But I don't know if you're familiar with the Columbia Pike district that is in Arlington County, Virginia, but I think that they've done a pretty good job there in terms of increasing densities fairly substantial, that are adjacent to single family neighborhoods behind that corridor, using form and design, which, we'll send you a copy of that district, which Dover Cole actually developed and did the work on that. So I'm optimistic that you can definitely do some higher density that would fit in, but the question is how what's the limit going to be? Where are you going to draw the line? So, any other questions?
no, I just wanted to ask staff if these maps were not included in our package that we printed, and it's hard to look at them closely. If staff wouldn't mind sending us the last set of group of maps that has all this information on it to us.
Yeah, it might be good. Jeff and Craig, can y'all just send your PowerPoint to everybody? And then you'll be able to see the whole thing.
I actually think we have it.
Oh, you do?
Yeah, it was in the original email.
Okay.
Oh, okay, I didn't go to the original one. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Harry.
If you can't find it, if you'll let us know, we will send it to you. Sure. Because one of the things we did really feel like it was important to see at this stage was geographically, where these areas are. So I think it gives you a much better sense of the kind of issues that we're going to be addressing as we move forward. Okay, based upon sort of that background, based upon these elevation zones and the other strategy that is proposed, the next issue in this section that we looked at was, okay, what actions has the city taken already to address this rising water environment? And then what, based on the policy recommendations in the plan and other points that we heard in talking to the community, need to be done? First thing we want to point out, and we do so on this slide, is that there have been actions, some fairly aggressive actions that the community has already taken to deal with a rising water environment. First of all, there is now a standard in place that base flood elevation, but the building must be 2 feet above base flood elevation. There are many communities right now that are just have to be at base flood elevation. So that was a significant change. I will point out to you, just so you're aware, Norfolk, Virginia, where we actually work with them on their development code update, and they have serious flooding issues now. They've gone to 3 feet above base flood elevation. In addition to that, you went through an extensive rewrite and rethinking of your stormwater management practices, and you updated the stormwater design manual in 2020. A major improvement in addressing rising water environment. As of this year, there's now a prohibition on using slab on grade foundations in the 100-year floodplain in the SFHA. So, And then there is, you currently have that Upper Peninsula District incentive system, which has also been a benefit. In terms of based upon the policy direction in the plan, we suggest that these additional actions be taken place. And the first two deal with sort of using the zoning districts to address this water rising environment. We've talked about I'm sure the name will change, this LI district, this low impact district, but the area that has been identified as low impact, impacted and conserved, we would create a new zone district for this area, which would recognize the flooding and the rising water environment that is occurring. Our thinking in terms of this district would be that it might be a nuanced or refined depending on the location geographically in the community, but it would reduce the allowed uses in this area. It would reduce densities and intensities. It would support flexibility provisions that allow for the enhancement of natural systems to absorb a rising water. And then it would limit development that could be built back after casualty damage. So it's pretty, this would be a significant change in what is being proposed based upon your existing zoning structure. Second thing, in terms of the zoning districts, is that we are recommending in these high ground areas, the city center and the neighborhood edge, specifically land use categories, that the base zone districts be mapped that would allow for higher density, intensity, mixed use development to occur. Jeff talked about the RMH district, the CL district, and we talked about the foreign districts. So, and the other thing, and I mentioned this earlier, is that, the assessment also recommends focusing the incentive programs for affordable housing in high ground areas. In other words, those locations where there is a city center designation and a neighborhood edge designation. I will tell you that in at least one of the prior meetings that we had, I believe it was with the citizen advisory panel, that there was a suggestion that the incentive programs for affordable housing be broadened, that they be allowed outside of those two land use categories. And then finally, what we're proposing, in other words, let me go back. There's very clear policy direction about, the low impacted conserved land use categories and then this high ground land use categories, I'd say the gray area, or in these other two zones. So what we are proposing to do, and it would apply not only in the compound flood risk zone and the other in the adapt zone, but in these other two categories, or these other two land use categories, is to create a resiliency index, which would apply generally to development in the community. Now, it will be nuanced. In other words, there are several sort of key elements that I want to highlight here. The actual index itself would be flexible to the extent that it will be point-based. In other words, that a development applicant would have to achieve a number of points to improve the resiliency of development in the location where they are. They would have a menu of options to choose from, but they would have to receive a certain number of points. Our thinking right now is that point system will be, number one, would have a number of components. In other words, it would be the point system in terms of the points you would have to achieve, and maybe even some of the focus of the actions would differ depending on which area of the community that you would be located in. For example, in the high ground area, there would probably be a much stronger emphasis on what I would call more general sustainability requirements, and ensuring, for example, that your stormwater practices aren't going to create downstream flooding problems in these lower elevation zones. And I'm just giving some examples because this is going to be one of the big challenges for us in terms of the drafting, because this is something that hasn't been done in too many places in the country. But in the adapt zone or the compound flood risk zone, for example, the emphasis might be on risk reduction and stormwater management, or risk reduction and stormwater management and addressing, other flooding related requirements. So that resiliency index is something that is proposed to be developed and applied throughout the community. The other standards that we're recommending is that there be standards to deal with visual compatibility between existing and new elevated development. If we're going to ask development to elevate more, then we need to make sure that it is compatible with existing development in the community. And then the other thing that we recommend is the consideration of a transfer of development rights program out of this LI land use category, since we are proposing a new zone district in that category, which is going to reduce the types of uses allowed as well as the density intensity. Those are the recommendations, and I'm going to pause here, see if there are any questions, comments.
Mr. Chairman, once again, we're in a section that would probably require a good half an hour on its own, and I'm looking at my clock. There are so many new and excellent ideas in here, but they're new and they probably require some pro and con discussion. Just off the top of my head, so you hear them. This recommendation for the low impact conserved land, when you look at those maps, you begin to wonder, is somebody going to get downzoned, and how are they going to feel about that? I just want to say that about that. The density and resiliency indexes that are being proposed and the incentive tables that bounce off of the Upper Peninsula that are being proposed, these are all excellent ideas. But I know the table that supported the UP zoning had some issues with it, where they sounded good on paper, but nobody picked them because they were problematic. So we need to study those kinds of incentives and incentive tables and point systems very critically based on the issues that we've had with other ones. So I just want to be on the record to say, this is very progressive, very interesting, has a lot of great ideas, but it's kind of a lot to swallow and comment on in maybe just 5 minutes.
Yeah, I agree. I think we're probably best digesting this and following back up with some more discussion.
Sunday.
Any other questions?
Any other questions? Jeff, it's 12 o'clock.
Okay,
This guy just called me.
I did want to throw out there, Mr. Chairman, if I might, just real quick, because Ms. Jacobs made an excellent point. One of the big community conversations we are going to have, and that comes out, and specifically in this section, and I've said this all along since I introduced the idea of doing this project and talking to council on getting the budget for it, there will be properties that will be downzoned as a part of this effort. There will be properties that will be identified that are in areas that with the information we have today, we know they're not compatible with the development potential that their current zoning would have otherwise allowed for. And so, that will be a big part of the conversation we're going to need to have as a community, as a planning commission, as a city council, as we're moving forward and identifying those properties where there may be a reduction of the currently perceived right versus what the reality of the potential is. And so I just want to make sure that we're all keeping that in mind, because that is really a big part of this discussion for the zoning code rewrite, and it's been a part of that kind of conversation from the beginning. So I just want to kind of underscore what Ms. Jacobs said. There will be people, they will have feelings, and we're going to have those conversations with folks as we're moving forward. It is going to be a hard conversation with some folks, I think, but at the end of the day, I think it's going to be what's best for the community. And I think that's part of the reason why the team is looking at that transfer of development rights. Maybe there's some opportunities we can do some things that might offset some of that hard feeling at some point. But again, big conversation. Just wanted to make sure that we underscore that for everybody listening.
And I would like to underscore it again. The city has already purchased back property that had a by right development on it that just continued to flood and flood and flood and flood and flood in West Ashley. So we need to bring those examples forward so communities understand why we're moving forward in this direction. Thank you.
Okay. So actually, I have a prior commitment that I'm going to have to go to, but Jeff is going to cover the last two themes, or if we have time, the last two themes. So thank you. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. There we go. So theme 4 is about housing. Our recommendation is to really address housing issues in two ways, as the title of the theme indicates. To update the regulations to basically allow more types of housing, to encourage development that's not just large multifamily apartment buildings or single family development, but to allow and encourage development that sort of fits into that missing middle. The other part is affordable housing. And so that's what we're going to talk about in this theme. So I think everyone is aware, and this is not a Charleston specific issue, but it is something that's happening throughout the country, is that housing costs are increasing at really incredible rates. The city plan has some data in that. This is, 3 years old. It dates back to sort of the end of the beginning of the pandemic period. But since then, housing costs have continued to explode. But even looking at that decade, while housing costs increased by 50%, the median household income only increased by 31%. And so there's a real mismatch between the type of housing that's available and the cost of that housing. And the result is a lot of Charleston residents are cost burdened. So they're spending a significantly high proportion of their annual gross income on housing. It's particularly acute with folks at lower income levels, where it's most challenging for them to find places to live. City plan indicates, and that might be a typo there, but that there's a lot of new affordable housing units that need to be built. And if you look at the pace of the development of affordable housing over the last few years, I mean, the city's made a lot of efforts and done some really good things, both on the regulatory side and on the spending money to get more affordable housing. But there's just simply not enough supply being created to match the demand. One of the results of the current zoning ordinance is that there's limited land available in the city for by right residential uses other than those single family detached homes. So in most of the city, in residential districts, both single family and multifamily, the diverse residential districts, as well as most of the business and mixed use districts, you can do single family detached dwellings by right. You can do single family attached dwellings in many districts as a conditional use. So there's some additional standards. Two family districts are allowed in still fewer districts. And then you can do multifamily developments by right in some of those diverse residential units, but there's no sort of, there's that middle type of housing that's not as dense as those multifamily dwellings. Your three family and four family, perhaps your mansion apartments that go up to 6 units, your other types of housing such as cottage home developments that aren't really discussed within the zoning ordinance. And so there's not, you can't do those sorts of projects by right in much of the city. A 4-unit development is treated the same as a 240-unit development, as far as the regulations are concerned. The city plan, one of the key recommendations in the city's plan, acknowledging these housing challenges, is to encourage, encourage and incentivize a diversity of housing types, to allow, a variety of housing options that can be in communities that are mixed use, that have not only residential uses, but also commercial and civic uses. That not only, provides additional housing options, but it also provides opportunities for folks to meet some of their daily needs, shopping, personal services options without getting in a car. And so it has those benefits as well. Other city plan objectives call for providing enhanced affordable housing throughout the city, both by strengthening the incentives for affordable housing and by removing obstacles and reducing regulatory barriers. So I'm going to take these sort of on one by one. First of all, one of the key recommendations of the assessment is that the code should allow for a diversity of housing types by right in different districts, as well as strengthening the affordable housing incentives in appropriate places. So, we talked earlier about some of the recommended changes to the zone districts, consolidating some of those single family only districts with some of those lower intensity diverse residential districts. And considering allowing additional types of housing by right. So I've mentioned all of these before, the 3-family and 4-family units, triplexes and fourplexes, mansion apartments, courtyard apartments, cottage court units, as well as live-work units. To make sure they're of the type of quality that the city wants to see, we recommend, as we discussed earlier, that they be subject to basic form and design standards. And you can see the list of districts where we suggest that they might be included. And that's the new residential mixed low, medium, and high districts that are outside the Lower Peninsula, the medium and high districts on the Lower Peninsula, as well as those mixed use districts, and of course the form-based districts. Now on the affordable housing side, there's currently a significant number of incentive programs for affordable housing. There's also, a recent program, the Priority Affordable Housing Program, which provides developers who meet certain criteria, including that more than 50% of a project is affordable housing. It provides them sort of an expedited development review process. We recommend building on the current regulations by taking the city's current set of good, but sort of scattered throughout the code set of affordable housing incentives and consolidating them in one place, putting them in one section of the regulations to make clear what incentives are available, how they apply, and that makes it easier to sort of calibrate them and incorporate best practices to make sure that over time the city is meeting its affordable housing goals and that these incentives are doing the best job they can in helping meet those goals. We also think that it's important, given the rising water environment, the increasing risk of flooding, that the incentives for affordable housing be focused in those areas that are at lower risk of flooding. Because the last thing I think we all want to do is to build affordable housing in areas where the folks who live there, who have fewer financial resources, are subject to extensive flooding. So we do recommend that the incentives be allowed generally, but they be focused in those higher elevations and those flume categories where additional development is encouraged. And again, we'll take a close look at them and make sure they incorporate best practices. This is the same map you saw earlier with the high ground and with the neighborhood edge and the city centers. I don't want to go over that again, but just wanted to sort of emphasize that, location matters a lot. And we think one of the project calls for an elevation-based zoning ordinance. And we think it's important to make sure that, we're encouraging future affordable development that's going to require, incentives and in some cases, money from the city. We want to make sure that those are placed in parts of the city where they'll last and be resilient. So questions or comments about that? Yes.
Yes, very quickly. A lot of people don't understand this missing middle. They get really upset with townhouses and stuff. I think it would be very helpful as when we bring this into the public that we find some examples currently functioning in the city to show that this is not such a horrible thing to consider. And you don't have to look very far. You can come into my neighborhood of Burns Downs, high density with lots of little accessory dwelling units that have been in this neighborhood for a long time. You can also go into a very historic neighborhood like Old Windermere, where there are duplexes and townhomes. And so people say, oh, well, yeah, I like that neighborhood and they work well in that neighborhood. I think that would be extremely helpful to educate the public to see that this is just not some aberrant idea that's hard to live with. Also, on your slide 54, what was the source of that map that you showed on slide 54?
Give me 1 second.
This one right here?
Yeah, that's the map out of the city's land and water analysis.
That's what I thought. That's what I thought. Those maps are very, very telling, and I hope that we get to see them more thoroughly very soon. Thank you.
Further questions? I think, Mr. Chair, if you want to hit a 12:30 time, I think we can get through the entire slide deck. And so that might, obviously there'll be need for follow-up discussion, but I think that will be, at least you'll have seen everything.
Yeah, let's keep pushing.
Okay. Very briefly, before we get onto the final theme, one of the pieces of direction for this project is to look at the current zoning ordinance through an equity lens. Now, zoning regulations don't always have a great history in the United States. They've often been used to exclude disfavored groups from opportunities. And in many cases that continues today. It's less overt, but the reason some of these policies were implemented in the first place was to have these sort of discriminatory impacts. The goal of looking at zoning through an equity perspective is to identify these exclusionary elements and find ways to address the barriers that continue to impact certain communities. So the American Planning Association a couple of years ago came out with this equity in zoning policy guide. We are fortunate enough to have one of the guide's co-authors on our team at Clarion, and he took a close look at the current zoning ordinance in the context of the recommendations in this policy guide. And we have a number of recommendations. So there's not a separate section about equity, but if you look through the different themes and the different recommendations, you'll see places where we have identified where we are making recommendations because of their equity impact. And in multiple cases, we actually reference the policies in the equity and zoning policy guide that we're referencing. So, the various items we looked at, there are substantive rules that have inequitable impact. Things like material standards can have significant impact on the ability for lower income communities to be able to afford to develop. Development review processes where discretion may be abused. There are some cases where, certain types of development require special review and, allow for public input where they may not be allowed even for development that has similar impacts. So the goal is to look at these development review process and make sure we can come up with clear criteria that are straightforward to apply, as much as possible to make sure everybody is treated evenly. And finally, looking at the zoning map, a pretty clear area is having allowing low-income residential housing next to an intensive industrial area. So again, that's integrated throughout the code assessment. These equity considerations have been incorporated into our recommendations for the zone districts, to the use regulations. A lot of the housing recommendations, they're directed in the city plan, but there's also equity considerations as well. We talked a little bit about the revisions to the development review procedures. Beyond just the notice question, we are going to take a close look at all of the criteria that apply to make sure they're as clear as possible to you, to the Board of Architectural Review, and to the City Council when they are reviewing projects. And we talk a little bit about updates to the development standards, which begins on the next slide. So one of the recommendations is to have enhanced connectivity requirements and requirements to enable multimodal access, such as by requiring sidewalks to improve access for people without automobiles. So I can take questions on that, but we have one last set of slides. This is about the development standards. So the development standards are, those are one of the three key parts of a zoning ordinance that Craig talked about 50 slides ago or so. And these are, address issues such as off-street parking, connectivity, landscaping. So I'm just going to hit some of the highlights here. We go into greater detail in the code assessment. One of the things that we're going to take a close look at are the current minimum off-street parking requirements. Currently part of downtown, there are no minimum parking requirements. We will look at your minimum parking requirements, look at peer communities, see, how they relate, whether in some circumstances they may be too high, some circumstances they may be too low. Identify there may be other areas where it may be appropriate to not have minimum parking requirements. And so we'll take a look at that as well. We think in appropriate locations, it would be a good thing to have some bicycle parking standards to encourage that type of multi-mobility. And to update the site and building design standards generally, not just in those form-based code areas, to prioritize bicycle and pedestrian access so that folks who, arrive at development on a sidewalk, don't have to walk through an active parking lot to get to the front door of a use. We talked a little bit about neighborhood compatibility in the context of the recommendation to delete the commercial transitional district. So these are general standards that protect residential neighborhoods, generally your lower intensity neighborhoods, from incompatible commercial or multifamily development through the use of special standards with the goal of orienting, the most potentially impactful site features away from these residential communities. So if you have a site that allows a drive-through that's near a residential neighborhood, you would require the drive-through to be a certain distance away from the residential side. You'd require that any speaker for the drive-through be directed away. You'd require, that the mass of the building be placed between the drive-through and the residential neighborhood. And so standards around dimensional standards near these residential neighborhoods, where parking can be located, how it can be oriented, sign standards, open space, things like that. We recommend a general set of exterior lighting standards. These are pretty simple to implement, but they can really have a significant impact on the quality of nighttime in development. And they also help protect the night sky. So this would include requirements for full cutoff light fixtures, and requirements on the amount of illumination that's allowed at the property line. We recommend that this updated zoning regulations include a comprehensive set of open space set-aside standards. So these standards require that new development or significant redevelopment of a site set aside land as open space. And the type of open space that's required to be set aside could vary based on where the development takes place. So if you have new development that's in a very heavily built up development, you might allow some of the land to be used as a plaza. Whereas if it's a less intensely developed area, you might prioritize the preservation of naturally sensitive lands, other natural lands, areas for active and passive recreation. And the open space requirements will vary based on whether you're talking about an industrial development or residential development or a mix of uses. Another key characteristic is that these set-asides need to be, actually usable and functional. It's not just the land, chopped up pieces of land that are left over after a developer has platted their lot. So we think these, we've implemented similar standards in a lot of communities, and we think they work well. And finally, we think you all have a pretty good set of landscaping and buffer standards. So we just have a variety of recommendations to incorporate, adding some basic planting and maintenance standards to set sort of a baseline requirement to make sure that the landscaping stays alive and continues to thrive. Some species requirements. We'll consider requiring foundation landscaping around the edges of buildings. This can help sort of aesthetically and to soften the impact of buildings on the natural environment, and also some refinements to the parking lot landscaping and screening standards. That is the last theme. So we have a couple slides after this just to wrap up. And I'll actually sort of go to this one. If you all have any further questions.
This is a minute little point, but under the open space, maybe add community gardens and dog parks. I just think community gardens are becoming a big, it's a big deal in real estate now to be able to have the ability to grow some of your own vegetables. And if we're going smaller and smaller lots, there needs to be spaces for people to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, in order to add to Cindy's, I really liked some of the things where y'all just put it bluntly, like don't use your open space as just your leftover land. Design it to where it really works for the community. I appreciate that sort of directness. And I want to take this opportunity to really thank y'all for such a comprehensive and deep dive into our code. The assessment was long, but it was pretty direct, easy to read and follow. There's a lot of good ideas in here that I think, as I've mentioned before, need greater discussion. But I just really appreciated your modernization, suggesting graphics, using plain English, having a procedure manual, and then your focus on things like affordable housing, equity, resilience, so things that came out of our city plan. It's obvious that y'all really took some time with us. And I really appreciate this. This was a lot to digest. I still have comments, and I know we're very close to out of time, but I would like to put on the record that what I found most interesting about your code assessment was table 2-3, which you took maybe all of our 100 zoning codes and showed us what percentage of land that they covered and whether that percentage of land was on the peninsula or off the peninsula. And it was quite telling because I dissected that and did the math on it. So I'd like this on the record for the people that are listening, that currently 90% of our land in the city of Charleston is governed by 6 codes, and then the compilation of the other 17 little tiny residential zones, 90% of that. If you remove the Daniel Island PUD from that discussion, and you remove those 17 other little smaller codes that add up to about 10%, you get 75% of our land is covered by 5 codes, which tells us that it is necessary to relook at this zoning code. And in addition, if you look at the percentage of land where that exists of those codes, greater than 95% of all the land is off the peninsula. So I would very much encourage y'all as we move forward to try to engage with the people that don't live on the peninsula or have meeting space off the peninsula, since we're talking about 75% of our code covering land that's pretty much off the peninsula. I think it's very important to engage those people in some manner, form or manner, but that was a very telling table. And thank you for taking the time to put that together and digest that.
Thank you. Other comments from the commission? Okay. Well, thank you all. Thanks to our consulting team. Thanks to the planning department. Commissioners, we obviously have a lot of more work to do here. This is a lot to digest, as Donna said. You know, as this schedule that we've looked at shows us we've got some time, but we need to dig into it. So, Christopher, anything else for the good of the order here?
No, I really appreciate the good discussion today. Great comments, great thoughts, and we will dive deeper and work up some times to do that. And really appreciate your time.
Great. Well, if there are no more comments, at 12:29, we will sign off.
Right on time.
Great job, guys.
Well done. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Jeff.
Thank you.